morning, everybody. Welcome aboard here to the Sports Talk Nation. Michael Cohen here with you. For several weeks, if not months, we've had an opportunity here to talk about some good news with the Mets, but today, not the case. As we have to talk about some not so good news, it's been a really bad week. Bad week for the New York Mets in a lot of ways, and for Major League Baseball for that matter. So let's just go in right into it here. I'll try to be as blunt as I possibly can on this issue here with regards to what happened here with the Mets and their now former general manager, Jared Porter, who, according to the story by ESPN and written by Mina Kimes and Jeff Passan on Monday night, the story that came out around 11 o'clock on Monday night, that Porter, when he was a member of the Chicago Cubs front office back in 2016, had sent lewd pictures, including photos of his own private parts, to a female reporter, journalist, who also happened to be a foreign correspondent for that matter. And if you read the article, you saw that one who, according to the article, didn't really speak English all too well. And of course, he had sent over 60 text messages in what was clearly forms of sexual harassment for that matter. And certainly the Mets did the right thing in firing Porter almost immediately. Around 7:30 on Tuesday morning, Steve Cohen going ahead, as well as baseball president Sandy Alderson, firing Porter almost immediately for cause, and he will not see a dime of his contract for that matter, as the Mets had to move on from Jared Porter. There was no question about that. That kind of behavior cannot be accepted. It cannot be tolerated. And a couple things that you have to take from Alderson's press conference that came up on Tuesday. The Mets, when they the Mets tried to put out there that they did not know anything about Porter's disturbing history. They didn't know anything. That's the claim that the Mets want to put out there, that they heard no dissenting voice or opinions about him. And that is, when you think about it, kind of troubling in a lot of ways. And even Alderson himself said that, and this is his own admission, that the team did not get any kind of vetting or any kind of opinions from any women who were working in baseball, and mentioned that there wasn't many women in high executive positions to begin with in baseball. And we can go on and on about that as well. Certainly, from the diversity standpoint, that's why it's important to have as many different kind of voices and opinions as much as possible, for that matter, because of a vetting process much like this. You want to know as much about the person as you possibly can that you're probably going to hire, and it would be certainly helpful to hear from as many people as possible. Alderson's own comments saying there was not a single recommendation from women, and that's a reflection of the demographics of the game today in the front offices. That says something very loudly, and it does. What really also has to trouble up people is the fact that how is it that the Mets, not just the Mets, but also the Chicago Cubs, the Arizona Diamondbacks, the Boston Red Sox, these are the teams that Porter worked for, had no idea that this guy had this kind of history. That boggles my mind. And also the fact that there is supposedly, as I mentioned in the story, that one person who was involved, who was from the Cubs, who apparently doesn't work for the Cubs anymore, who was a quote-unquote source for this story as well. Who was that person? That's what I want to know. And are there people who, in the Cubs, whether it be around Major League Baseball, who know of this kind of behavior by Porter? And who knows? Maybe there's other types of circumstances like this as well. It's unfortunate that in this day and age we have too many of these kind of stories that come up. And usually what happens is then we start to hear other stories or similar stories for that matter. That's why Major League Baseball is going to start to do an investigation. There was an investigation about this situation, as they have to. They're certainly going to question that individual who is the so-called source, or try to question anybody involved with the Cubs back in 2016. And who knows who else? Maybe it's people from the Diamondbacks, people from the Red Sox, even from the Mets for that matter. There has to be some kind of investigation that has to take place because, again, that kind of behavior can't be tolerated at all, especially from somebody just trying to get a story about the Cubs or about the baseball team, or even in this case now with the Mets for that matter. You can't have that kind of behavior at all. It cannot be tolerated. And I give the Mets props for going out there right away and making the move to fire Jared Porter anyway. And let's be honest, does it really affect as far as the baseball standpoint, it really doesn't change much because Sandy Alderson had been the point man making a lot of the moves this offseason anyway. The Lindor deal was in the process before the Mets ever brought in Jared Porter, for that matter. So from that standpoint, the Mets move on. There's going to be a lot more onus now on Sandy Alderson from the baseball standpoint. There's going to be now, the Mets said they weren't going to have directly an interim manager, a general manager. They were going to have kind of like a team of people in the front office to fill that role, including their assistant general manager, Zach Scott, who was a finalist for the job to begin with. But it does speak to a disturbing situation in baseball where you have that kind of behavior go on, and it doesn't get really thoroughly investigated, and maybe even in some disturbing cases, even accepted for that matter in some circles in baseball. And that's something that Major League Baseball has to look into and has to weed out. Absolutely, they cannot have that anymore, for that matter. So, let me just pivot here to the next story that affects the Mets, and that is the story about George Springer. Springer was thought by a lot of people to be a top target for the Mets. And again, of course, he now signed late last night with the Toronto Blue Jays, 6 years, $150 million, $25 million a year. Now, does this hurt the Mets? It hurts the Mets from the standpoint that they lose a player who averaged about 22, 23 home runs a year in 5 of the last 6 seasons. A guy who had 39 home runs and 96 RBIs 2 years ago in 2019. A guy who was a 3-time All-Star with the Houston Astros. You lose that opportunity to have that player on your team. Does hurt. It also hurts up the middle because Springer's a fairly good defensive center fielder, and now you're looking at a situation right now where you're looking at potentially Brandon Nimmo in center and Dom Smith, who should be a DH, in left field. Remember, there probably won't be a DH in the National League this year, so that hurts from that standpoint. At the same time, it does give the Mets a lot of flexibility. Because think about this. The Mets right now, active payroll is $167 million. You add minor league contracts and taxes, benefits, what have you. It's about $185 million payroll the Mets have this year. They don't want to go over the $210 million threshold, which will then mean they'll have to pay even more as far as the tax is concerned. Luxury tax, for that matter. You have Francisco Lindor, who is a free agent to be next offseason, who wants to be paid big money. Mookie Betts type money, $300 million range, for that matter. You have Michael Conforto, who won in his arbitration, is going to make $12.5 million this year, is a free agent next year. Think about this for a second. You do the math. This now gives the Mets an opportunity to focus on extending Lindor and Conforto potentially next year, and for long-term contracts. You also have to keep in mind you have Jacob deGrom signed through 2024. He's getting about $20.5 million each of the next 2 years. This year he's getting like $21 or $22 million. And then you have James McCann making about $10 million a year over the next 4 years as well. So let's just say, focusing on Lindor and Springer, if you had brought in Springer at $25 million a year, and you have Lindor, who's seeking $300 million a year. So, you figure a 7-8 year contract, $300 million a year was like $33, $35 million a year. Now you're talking about like about a third of your payroll to 2 players. And that's going to be, that is something that baseball teams don't necessarily want. That's what we're seeing here with the Yankees right now with Garrett Cole and Giancarlo Stanton. That's why their offseason has been kind of slow until they made the move to bring back DJ LeMahieu at more of a team-friendly discounted rate of about $90 million over 6 years. You have to get very creative then. So this gives the Mets some flexibility to make the move for Lindor, or even another shortstop free agent next year, potentially extend Conforto, and continue to make solid moves for that matter. So from that standpoint, it works. And also, you can still make moves this year. Jackie Bradley Jr. is around the same age as George Springer. He's 31 years old. Good defensive center fielder. Not the hitter that Springer is. He's a .239 hitter compared to Springer, who's like a, .276, .280 hitter lifetime. So you lose a little bit of offense with Jackie Bradley Jr., but you get some defense there, and that's what you need in center field. You can go out there and get a Brad Hand, who's a solid middle reliever. And Roberto Osuna is also out there, a guy who has like a 2.84 ERA in as a reliever as well. So there's chances, opportunities for the Mets to go out there, make some more moves that could be more prudent financially for them moving forward towards this season and even for next season. So yes, it does stink. It sucks that the Mets lose out on George Springer. It would have been an awesome to see, Springer and Lindor and have this monster lineup for that matter. And that's all the fans were talking about for much of the offseason. But it's not going to happen. Reality bites sometimes, and it bit the Mets here for that matter. But again, at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world for the New York Mets. So, no Springer, move on. We can all move on. We can all live with that. And we'll see what the Mets can do moving forward as far as getting ready for the 2021 season. So, again, not a great week for the Mets here, folks. The Jared Porter news, as I said before, very disturbing. The Mets did what they had to do to get him out of there as soon as possible. And now you have this situation with Springer going to the Blue Jays. Blue Jays are going to have a pretty sick lineup for that matter. You're talking about Vlad Guerrero Jr. and Biggio and Bichette, and they're going to be a monster team to deal with this year in the AL East. For that matter, with the Toronto Blue Jays, they're going to be good. They're going to be fun to watch with all the power they're going to have there. But for the Mets, they move on, and they can now get creative, and they can now have a team and start to focus on building a team that can be financially sustainable on the field as well. So remember, folks, to follow us on facebook.com/openmicprogram, at openmicNJ on Twitter. And remember, like and subscribe right here to the Sports Talk Nation right here on YouTube. Talk to you next time.